declare themselves?
Oh, maybe there's a problem now. They were just, I was just so, oh yeah, I see Shehnaz.
Oh, there's Shehnaz. Hi,
Yeah.
Shehnaz. Hi, great to have you here. Do you mind if I introduce you?
No problem. Go ahead.
Right. And Lawrence, I see you here. Welcome. So, I mean, I've got a lot about these people here. So I'm just going to, so they're going to be presenting a workshop on critical perspectives towards humanizing birth. What does a decolonial and intersectional framing offer midwifery? And I'm very, very excited to be part of this. So we've got Shehnaz Munshi. She's a health policy and systems researcher and activist with a particular interest in feminist and decolonial scholarship and practice. She is from South Africa, and she's manages the Shehnaz Family VITS program on social determinants of health and health inequality at the School of Public Health at the University of Witwatersrand here in South Africa. She is currently working on a concept note for a PhD. Is that right, Shehnaz? And her research, policy engagement, and activism has focused on strengthening the implementation of community health worker policy and primary health care re-engineering in the national health NHI context. She was also a researcher on behavior change intervention, a study called the Sonke Change Trial, which sought to determine the effectiveness of a multi-level gender transformation model in preventing men's use of violence against women and girls. So welcome, Shehnaz. And then her partner in crime is Louskieter, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine here at UCT. And I must embarrassingly say I haven't met Lance in person yet, and he's just across the road from where I am. So Lance is a health systems and policy researcher with a particular interest in queer and decolonial scholarship. Their advocacy includes partnering with sex worker education and advocacy task force SWET here in the Western Cape, and serving as a board member of the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition, where they champion the rights for the rights and access and implementation of sexual and reproductive health and justice for sex workers, queer people, and people with intersecting marginalities. Lance's research includes health systems responsiveness, decolonizing global health, African feminism, community health systems, queer, trans, and gender diverse people's health and rights, decriminalizing of sex work, health equity, sexual and reproductive health and justice, intersectionality, and primary health care. Lance, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jason, and everyone.
We're just thinking maybe it's better if we all put our cameras off. Would that help with your connection?
Yeah, we can try that. That might be very good. And if it's okay, if you can just give me permission to share.
Right. Okay.
Yes, I'll make you co-host. Yes, you should be able to share right now, and then I'll take over if the power goes away.
Yes, I'm worried that of all things that my internet will cut out. I mean, the internet's out, that the computer will die because there's no more. And then I would have to transfer over to my phone, and Radante will continue sharing. So sorry for all these inconveniences. We only find out that the load shedding schedule happens on the morning sometimes, so, or the week, or it's just crazy. So thank you so much, everyone, for allowing us to be here. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to be in this space. Lance and myself find ourselves to be drawn a lot to the sexual reproductive health and rights world in thinking about decolonial and intersectional framing. But ourselves, we come from very different backgrounds, and most of our work is in health systems and policy, and for Lance, gender studies, and as was mentioned, SWET, and so on. So we come with varying perspectives, but we also would like you to learn with you and from you in how to engage these ideas and really put it into a framing. So while I attended a lot of the talks yesterday, for me, it was very clear that within this group, there is a lot of critical thinking going on because it's critical humanizing birth practice. This is a critical theory space. And I guess our biggest contribution today in thinking about this framing is to try and provide a framework in which to think about the ways in which coloniality manifests. So we're going to name and define coloniality and decoloniality. We're going to develop an understanding of how the oppressive past connects to today. And then we're going to consider a decolonial project. And I'd like us to have a more interactive day. So when, if anyone has anything to share, please put your mic off and speak because we won't be able to see you or hands. So feel free to interact and allow this, as it is a kind of a workshopy space, to rather step in and take ownership of the space and bring some ideas in. Lance, my colleague is not feeling too well, so I think you're going to spend a lot of time hearing from me, but Lance will be coming in and out at various points, and I'll be drawing on Lance as well through the conversation. So before we start, we would like to connect to our own critical orientation, to our own field of public health, but then also the field of sexual reproductive health and rights, just more generally. And for us, this is important because it positions us in a understanding in which we want to understand the relationship of power. And we're locating this relationship of power between the colonized and the colonizer. And we are considering ourselves as a continued colonized people. And we're not looking only at just as us as people, but the representations, our subjectivities, our beliefs, our cultures, and our practices, and the colonizer to not just be a particular group of people, but the colonial systems, the representations of those who are considered colonizers, the places, spaces, hegemonic systems of domination, centers of power, the health system, and so on. And this critical orientation helps us to seek a relationship of dominance and resistance that foregrounds politics, power, and positionality. And the reorientation centers the knowledge, realities, and people in historically colonized contexts as valuable and legitimate knowledge holders. And we're very clear that we take a reproductive justice and intersectional lens in our critical orientation. And what we try to represent visually is, if you look at the three buildings, I wonder if anybody can just put your mic on and tell me, do you know where these three buildings actually are?
I don't know.
Anyone?
One is the University of Cape Town, the top right.
Yes. Well, that's the best answer. I mean, if you look at the top right, we have University of Cape Town. Next to that is my university in Johannesburg, University of the Witwatersrand. And the picture below is actually Cambridge University in the UK. And what's really clear and striking is that the relationship of power that we're talking about is not located in a kind of a north-south divide that is geographically north and south. It is also within our countries. And if you look at from an epistemic perspective, the knowledge, the environment in which knowledge was created was built by the colonizer. And those buildings represent how knowledge spaces look. So the look and the feel is representative of a colonial structure. And actually, these buildings were not meant for people like Lance and I, because this is a settler colonial country, South Africa. And so we're meant to be marginalized and to be out and in other institutions, or not really in institution of higher learning at all. And this you'll see in India, you will see it across the African continent, that these representations of institutions of higher learning in the colonial systems are deeply entrenched here in ways that sometimes we don't we're not always aware of. So just to make sure that all of us are on the same page, we want to make a clear distinction when talking about what colonialism is and what coloniality is. And again, I invite people to come in if you have anything more to share. But we talk about colonialism as this complex power structure that transforms people's lives. And it is this invention, the actual invention and institutionalizing of the asymmetrical power relationship between those that are citizens and those that are subjects. And it economically, this institutes the dispossession and transfer of resources from those who are indigenous to those who are conquering and foreign. And if you look at the image, I mean, I usually start with this image and then go into the definition, but the image is very clear that the people in front who are in a kind of safari outfit with the hat and the top, they are healing somebody's injured back. But when you start to actually ask the questions of why are they there? What are they there for? Who's in the foreground of this image? Who's in the background? Who is seen as knowledge holders? Who is seen as subjects? Who is seen as citizen? It becomes quite difficult to not see that there is an asymmetrical power relation, that so these people in the front have come as outsiders in this village, and they're taking over certain actions and practices, yet it looks like they're doing a healing work. So I think it's everything that that was discussing yesterday, but this is what colonialism looked like. And perhaps the argument is that that system isn't really gone, that coloniality is the invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after direct colonization ended. Nelson Maldonado Torres was actually doing a winter decolonial school in the University of KZN today, speaks about the idea that as modern subjects, we are breathing in coloniality all the time. We're looking at it, we're breathing it in, we're touching it, we're engaging with it every day. And I think the project is to really become aware of this in our everyday. So the idea is to start with this. So Puerto Rican decolonial scholars spoke about the myth of the post-colonial world, to say that despite this notion of the elimination of colonial administration, that it had amounted to decolonization is a myth, okay? And in actual fact, the multiple global structures put in place over 450 years ago did not disappear with the jurisdictional political decolonization of the periphery. We continue to live under what is called the colonial matrix of power. And this is a term coined by Annabelle Buchanda. So to try and link it back to health, how does this colonial matrix of power, how do we understand it in the context of health, midwifery care, sexual reproductive health, global health? And here I've brought up a framework of the social and structural determinants of health. And you will see that in some of these later editions of the structural determinants of health, there is an acknowledgement of intersectionality. You'll see in the box above, where it says social economic inequalities, gender, sexual, ethnicity, disability, and migration. And under the structural drivers of health inequity, you'll see political, social, cultural, economic structures, natural environment, land, climate change, history and legacy of ongoing colonialism and structural racism. And the issue of land is really central to a South African context where land, or even many parts of the world, where land disposition had occurred and land ownership is no longer in the hands of those who are indigenous to those communities, but are now part of the colonial matrix of power. And these are drivers of maternal and child health, and we need to consider those. The other framework that we really like to think through, and of course is rooted in this group, as we heard from yesterday, is the understanding of reproductive justice as a framing that can help us to organize our thinking and to situate institutional violence, medicalization of human bodies, eugenics, systems of oppression, and social control around issues. And you can see the framework at the bottom on the in red. It highlights some of the elements that we've been discussing, that we all have been discussing. And the idea that reproductive justice centers the needs and distributes power to marginalized communities, acknowledges the historical and ongoing harms, including those perpetuated in healthcare and public health institutions, addresses the root cause of injustice. When reading these concepts of reproductive justice, my imaginary immediately links to the images that were shared by Jason earlier, because the context in which we are trying to advance reproductive justice is particular to our context, but is rooted in deep-seated oppression, and is quite, well, we saw the images, and I want you to hold those images or recall those images that were put up earlier in the presentation, because it is in this context where we feel the sense of anger and frustration, and we see the dehumanization occurring on an everyday basis, that we're trying to, that is re-traumatizing, that encourages shame, and that we're trying to turn upside down, inside out. Yeah, and the other theory that we're very interested in considering is the idea of critical race lens. And we're aware that there's a lot of reports coming out of America, especially on critical race lens in public health and structural racism. But it is incredibly important to understand or acknowledge that South Africa is built on a racialized structure. So for us, we are confronted by race dynamics in every interaction, and often you would find the race interactions occur between the practitioner and the patient, and that power dynamic is really important to think about. And even my work with community health workers who are now starting to go into communities to screen for pregnancy, for postpartum care needs, for disability, and are playing a role in sexual reproductive health and rights. The marginalization that these women face is part of the compounded problem of who are the people we are working with, whose lives matter, and why is it that the poor, largely Black, poor women in South Africa receive poor quality care. And they, despite the community health workers protesting, putting their own body on the line so that they can provide adequate care for the women that they work with. And the other framework we try to bring about is alternative paradigms of knowledge that really try to engage with other cosmologies of knowledge, other senses of understanding the self. So I'm sorry for bringing all of these theories in, but I wanted to acknowledge that these are all part of our critical frame. But we're going to really zone into a framework of analysis for thinking about coloniality of power, of knowledge, and being. And this framework is developed by a few decolonial scholars, but Sabelo and Ndlovu-Gacheni brought them all together in a way to demonstrate how coloniality operates and manifests at multiple levels. And this is the framework of analysis with which we want to unpack the existing forms of coloniality and neocolonialism. And we want to be able to see the structural processes that sustain the oppressive power in knowledge production in the sexual, reproductive, and health and rights sector as a whole, and especially in terms of birthing. So before I move on, are there any questions for clarity, or can we, can I move on? What I'll be moving on to is defining coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. But I'd just like to get anyone, so just unmute and we can chat, or we'll move on. Okay, we'll engage later, but feel free to just interrupt. Okay, so what is the coloniality of power? So the coloniality of power refers to an asymmetrical power relations. It's really the structural processes within what we're calling the global imperial design. And I think yesterday, if we have to apply to the medical context, the medical industrial complex, you know, so from whichever lens you want to look at, but that sustains a kind of superiority of the North and maintains an inferiority of the South. And this superiority or this global imperial design, it operates through technologies. So, you know, we always look at technologies as our phone or our computers, or, you know, I don't know if you can hear the generator somewhere out there to try and offset the, for some people's lack of electricity. These are technologies that help us to function. But the technologies that we are talking about here, technologies of coloniality, those that institute domination, control, exploitation, and violence, known as the colonial matrix of power, and they affect all dimensions of life, and they consist of intersecting domains of control, of power, economic, political, military, gender, sexuality, knowledge, subjectivities, epistemic, linguistic, all kinds of power. And for us to try and concretize it, we've put some pictures here to show how eugenics is a technology of power that is controlled by race, authority, politics, subjectivities. Forced sterilization is another form of coloniality of power. The criminalization of people of different genders, and in this case, the Hijra community in India is another example of the British Empire walking into India and dehumanizing a group of people who were previously seen as important and central to Indian society. And of course, we now sitting with every contemporary coloniality with the gag rule and the Roe versus Wade law, and this is another form of imperial power over women's bodies. So coloniality of knowledge, what is this? It refers to the process of, is everybody cool with coloniality of power? Great, so far with you, I like that. Because if you aren't, we're gonna be doing an exercise and you're gonna have to. So please, please interrupt me if you need clarity. So coloniality of knowledge refers to the processes of domination over knowledge, And domination over production of knowledge, patterns of knowledge, the destruction, survival, and hierarchies of knowledge, decisions about which type of knowledge is legitimate ways of understanding the world. This is where, there were lots of mentioning of epistemic injustices yesterday. We would consider this a technology of domination, using knowledge as a means of control over who are knowledge creators. So, for example, in the image that Jason showed us, where the woman is lying on her back and her legs are up and a whole bunch of people standing over her, it's her body, yet she seems to be just something lying on the table. And it's an interesting image that's now stuck in my head of thinking about the knowledge that sits with her about her own lived experience, her own 9 months of nurturing this child, and so many other elements of knowledge around that, which I'm hoping that as experts in this space, that you will help us understand. So some of the ways that I've brought about, that Lance and I have thought through in relation to knowledge, is how language is used as a vehicle for racializing and colonized people. All of us are speaking English today in my only language, yet my parents are multilingual. And so this is the only language with which I can talk about pregnancy and birth. And so I've lost a whole lot of knowledge, Western paradigms of knowledge that are dominant, knowledge being deeply hierarchical, the use of Western scientific tools and instruments and methodologies within the research space, the priorities, who sets the priorities. So even in that image, if you had a researcher coming in, would the researcher speak to the woman who's lying, or the birthing person lying on the table, or would the researcher speak to the group of experts who are standing there? Who sets the priority of research, and how does that priority setting link so instrumentally to donors who perpetuate power? This idea that was brought up yesterday of philanthropy organizations, INGOs, who come in with their new techniques and kind of universalism and dominate. So I know I've rushed through this slide because there's a lot to unpack and to really unravel, but I really do hope that we can use some of these in thinking when we go off into the next 6 tasks. So then coloniality of being. As you can see, I stole this picture, but it's now not coinciding well with my slide. But the coloniality of being is the denial of humanity of certain people, the processes of inferiorization and dehumanization, and the othering of colonized people compared to the white subject. So if you all had to close your eyes and just bring yourself towards yourself, listen to your own breath, connect to your own bodies and your own being. And if you have to think about times in which you have felt dehumanized, or you felt inferiorized, or you experienced a microaggression, or if we have to just think about the images that were put up earlier by Jason, or the image on top, the experiences in the body is where it is felt, and this is the violence that is the violence that is imposed, and from that violence, the trauma that is felt. So I've just got some images of Indigenous Lives Matter. So we see that there have been protests against this kind of thing. But I stole this picture to kind of remind us that it is in those rooms where women are expected to give birth, these cold clinical spaces, that the structural violence dehumanizes them. And I'm hoping that this is something we're going to be able to discuss. So now that we have a deeper understanding of coloniality and the three elements of coloniality: power, knowledge.
Sorry,
and
can I
greed.
interrupt for just a second?
Yes.
Yeah, you asked us to interrupt, so I'm taking your request on honestly. So could you say a little bit in terms of being, like, when I read about coloniality and decolonization, which I haven't done a lot about, but Fanon and some Native American writers, they talk about this idea of the coloniality of being in terms not only of the human but also of nature. Could you reflect a little bit on that briefly, or does that come into how you're thinking about these things? And sorry for the interruption, but thank you.
Refer to nature. Is this nature in terms of the environment or?
Well, from a Native American perspective, it would be certainly in terms of the environment, but in terms of how we understand nature, because that affects how we understand being itself. So from a Native American perspective, when we talk about we are all related, they include in that the concept that we are related to animals, nature, that sort of thing. So if we change the idea of being, then we're changing that kind of concept as well.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely agreeing with you. And I'm hoping that you'll bring some of this out when we move to the next discussion. And I've just put back on the framework, the different cosmology of the South through an Aboriginal community practice, where, you know, the very outskirts is the housing, physical environment, which includes the natural environment, the ancestors, and so on. And I think a lot of ancient practices, the idea of the separation between the South and even other people, or the South and the environment, is a construct, and which is a Western construct, and it starts to take us back to where the philosophical underpinnings that drive coloniality. And Ramon Grosfugel talks to the philosophers that came up with ideas, I think, therefore I am, which is really individualizing the person as the central tenant and the most dominant form of thought and ideas, as opposed to African philosophy or indigenous Australian philosophy, which is, I think, therefore we are, or it's a shift away from just the I to how I connect to my own humanity and to the natural environment. And yes, that is very central to the idea of being. And if I have to apply it to women who give birth in the South African context, many women actually bury the umbilical cord in the ground. And that signifies home, and that signifies birthing and land and a deeper connection. So the idea of colonization came in and disrupted, dismantled, destroyed a lot of those practices and the respect for the environment that came with those practices. And yes, we now sit with extractive capitalism and so on. So thank you for bringing that up and just extending that. So yeah, so the idea is, now that we unpacking the problem in these three, and we organizing it in these three frames, what do we do? So we need to differentiate decolonization from decoloniality. And decolonization describes the process of direct colonial rule, right? It's the thing that Ramon Grosfugel spoke about, the removal of political power and so on. But he said it's a myth that it's all over. Decolonization does not automatically remove the effects of hundreds of years of colonial oppression, right? Which means that we're still sitting in the same situation, and it's actually time to do something about it. And you know, using indigenous framings, using intersectional feminism, using reproductive justice framings, using anti-racist framings, and using a decolonial frame and a combination of those and a critical engagement of those can help us in our struggle for emancipation. So decoloniality is a specific type of decolonization that advocates for the disruption of legacies of racial, gender, geopolitical inequalities and the domination in contemporary society. It calls for political, epistemic, and economic liberation, right? And the goal is to try and dislodge coloniality. So we saw how the technologies operate. We want to dislodge, we want to take away the energy, like load shedding, of coloniality. We want to de-link from the colonial matrix of power. So we need to disrupt, de-link, disentangle, move away from. We need to find liberation, reclamation, rebuilding. We need to think about centering Indigenous voices. And yesterday we had fascinating conversations and examples of ways in which many of you in this room are already doing that. And I suppose ways in which birthing homes that embody biopsychosocial approach, or birthing practitioners who are considering both abolitionism in the US, or in India, community health workers advocate for food security, where there's no real deep distinction between the work that you are doing in the birthing process or in the care process and the politics. Those are important examples of decoloniality. And I feel like we've got to discuss them a little bit deeper. And so in the exercise later, this is another slide I want you to try and hold on to try and think of elements where, and in fact, maybe I'm going to copy this and stick it into the Jamboard, or perhaps Redante, if you can just stick this image in the first page of the Jamboard, where we can start to think about issues of praxis. Because decoloniality is not an endpoint. We're not starting a journey of decoloniality with the goal that we're going to reach a certain point. It's a verb, and it's a practice and a praxis. And that practice and practice requires all of us to recall history, to recall our insights and recall memory, to remember ways of being and doing that were damaged, destroyed, killed off, genocide, libraries, epistemicides that were destroyed. It requires us to understand our own positionality and our politics. It requires us to do the deep reflexive work. And part of that work requires us to say, how am I colonized? How does coloniality continue to exist in my own ways of being and doing? How do I continue certain forms of oppression? Even as a brown body, how am I racializing my own body in certain ways? How do we think about advocacy and solidarity? Because even yesterday there was a deeper discussion that it isn't about moving alone. This is a journey that we move together. How is it about being intentional in decolonial praxis in terms of confronting power, in terms of thinking about knowledge practices differently, and in terms of shifting the ways in which we see ourselves in our being. And for many of us, it's about reckoning with experiences of imposter syndrome, of experiences of feeling not good enough, of experiences of feeling out of place, and reclaiming space, recognizing that my humanity and my value is connected to the earth and to my spirituality, or in outside of a Western cosmology. It's about thinking about how do we frame what we do, how do we take up voice, who do we give voice to, and how do we give up, and how do we take up space? And if I think back to that image that Jason had put with the woman lying the birthing person lying on the bed and the people standing in front, where was the conversation happening? Who was given voice? Who was given space in those spaces? How do we shift the framing? And if we go back to even my own publications that I write, who am I writing for? Am I writing for an international audience? Am I writing for women? And I know that all of you are engaging around professionalizing versus unprofessionalizing. How do you frame yourselves, your location, your so much of these things is up for discussion. And then this idea of commodification versus decoloniality, which I learned last week, which is really a deeper encouragement for us to consider that if we use decolonial thinking as a buzzword or as a point of interest, it loses its radical potential. It loses the imperative for disrupting coloniality in the way that we described before. It loses that delinking, disentangling, the reclamation project, the building. It becomes then an idea that we just consider. And in that way, we may fall into the trap of commodifying it. Yeah. So I think in terms of research, we're not going to really deep dive into the slide, but especially for researchers, there is also a need for us to take an epistemic shift, to really develop knowledges and to think about knowledges in a way that is respectful, caring, and responsible, and accounts for intersecting forms of oppression. And thinkers from the global South, decolonial thinkers, are calling us as researchers and practitioners to recognize that we cannot deliver the solutions to the problems of oppressed, but we can assist in the process of achieving the changes they seek. Community partners and marginal communities are experts of their own lives and most knowledgeable about the aspects of their daily life that need to change. And I wanted to just bring in two new concepts that I've just recently learned about. Well, it's just one new concept, but two actual quotes about this idea of combative decoloniality. And the idea of combative decoloniality is a term that's going to try and protect against decolonial thinking from becoming commodified, in a similar way that feminism had fallen trapped to when it became sort of mainstreamed. And yesterday someone mentioned in the morning that they can't connect to Western feminism because there's a or white feminism because of it doesn't consider certain subjectivities, or it becomes a form of idea that we need to consider, but not really a radical action. And the idea of combative decoloniality emerges when radicalized subjects start to address other racialized subjects in an effort to generate a sense of a collective struggle. So Maldonado Therese is not talking about combative decoloniality and this collective struggle as only standing on the front lines or only disrupting in ways that one would think of when you think of combative, which is like a warlike thing. But it's also by doing the very opposite that the Colonial Project wants us to do, which is to have a convening like this today where we're talking about humanizing birth, to include and invest financial resources and time to reconnecting to the land, to reconnecting to each other, to considering issues of care, to share a meal around a table, to plant trees, to dance and sing and engage in poetry. And that just reminded me that we wanted to recite a poem, but I think load shedding had completely disrupted that. Lance, if you would like to recite the poem, please let me know, or even play it. Yeah, so I wanted to engage with all of us to consider how do we think about power? How do we confront power using this kind of combative idea that is that is asking us to be a little bit more intentional in our disruptive work. And this quote is just really thinking about Fanon, and his life indicates that combativity calls for transcending the role of a medical doctor, and in some of your cases as midwives and doulas, and transcending the role in some of you are scholars. And these positions can offer important tools in the process of decolonization, but they can also turn counterproductive if they remain isolated and disconnected from collective movements and struggles. And I suppose that is a call for us to reorganize ourselves as part of the collective struggle of people, and to connect to the racialized and colonized subjects in acts of liberation, you know. And combativity requires acts of transgression, resignation, and so on. And I would like us to kind of consider some of these things. So I can see that my computer is just about dying, so I'm going to need to transition over to my phone. At least I managed to get to the end of my presentation, and maybe we can take a 3-minute break, and then Redante, perhaps you can put on the share the Jamboard link and share the screen or something. And I'm not sure if we can move out into breakout rooms. But what I would like everybody to do is to, if I can just stop sharing, is to maybe, if Redante, if you can just share the Jamboard. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name.
Shall I? Yes, I shared it now. Shall I also share my screen with it on it, or does everybody just go to the Jamboard themselves?
I think if you can do both.
Yeah.
So what I was hoping for, if we can move into breakout rooms, it would be amazing. But if we can't,
we can.
Possible. We can. Okay.
Yeah.
And how many people are we?
53.
Oh, okay. So do you suggest groups of how many? Do you think groups of 5?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Whatever you think works best for the exercise.
I think I'm going to change the exercise because we are quite a big group. So if you have a look at the, I don't know. Okay, let me just share my screen. If I die, then I'll just have to move on. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is we can put you all into groups of 5, and perhaps I would like each group to just look at this model, coloniality of power, knowledge, and being, and to maybe use 1 or 2 examples. So either your group can share examples of coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. And I think on the one side of the slide, if you can just put some sticky notes, and then I would like us to also, I'm going to just make sure that I replicate these slides. Sorry, I've just evolved my own activity on the fly. I hope you don't mind. But I think that what we're going to do is, if you can relate to the story you've just shared and consider some of the elements that I've brought up on decoloniality, and to share examples of decoloniality from your own practices. Lance, would you like to come in and maybe share a bit more? And if anybody else, are we clear on the activity? Does it sound valuable to you? Because the idea is for us to try and think through this framework and apply this framework, and then to come back and discuss it. Lance, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shehnaz. And sorry, apologies for my voice. I just asked for grace because I am not feeling well. My voice is going in and out. But I think that what the intention of this exercise is really for us to grapple with the ways in which coloniality manifests in our work, in our research, in our praxis, and particularly for all of you who are working and the incredible conversations that we've been having about the ways in which coloniality manifests, but also to generate a collective imaginative project for us as a collective to archive what the possibilities are actually, because I know, I think it was Paloma who shared in the chat room about the caution of not homogenizing and understanding the ecosystem of indigeneity, of decoloniality, and embracing an ecosystem of perspectives, but we are always stuck with where do we look to? How do we understand the multiplicity? How do we build this ecosystem and generate this archive? So I think this kind of collective imaginative project for thinking about examples of decoloniality within our particular contexts is going to be quite powerful as a collective learning space for how we deepen our quest to move beyond the canon, to transcend the Western canon. So that's all our input into it. And perhaps we'll close off with Lebo Mashile's poem at the end, Shehnaz, if you still want to share that. But thank you so much, and deep gratitude to everyone.
How much of time do we have left?
Half an hour.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna duplicate the slides, and then I think if we can move into the breakout rooms for 15 minutes.
Yes.
Or 20 minutes, what do you think? I think maybe 20 minutes, and then we can have some reflections for 10 minutes after, and then we'll share the poem.
Perfect, sounds wonderful. I will then make the breakout rooms for 5 people, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we do groups of 4, how would that work? 4, 8, 12.
I think, yeah, with 5, we have 10 groups approximately.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
10 groups is brilliant. Right.
Okay, I'll do it now.
Shehnaz, do you mind also sharing the slides on the chat for the community here to have access to those slides now, if that's possible? Thanks.
Okay, I will do the breakouts.
Oh, and just to say, wow, okay.
Yes, I think everyone can go there now.
Hi, guys.
Welcome back, everybody. Shall we give it a minute?
Thank you.
Okay, so there were 50 people, but now there's 37.
I'm not sure if we're still missing some. I think people were given 1 minute to break out the rooms. Maybe some are still in it, or maybe left because they were scared of breakout rooms.
Okay. So then perhaps we can just start the discussion, and as people join, to be fine. I mean, this is now the space for everybody to kind of reflect on the experiences, and if you've got a story to share with us around the examples you've unpacked, and perhaps something critical that you learned. And yeah, so over to you, Jason. I'm just going to let hands come up and let's have a rich discussion. Thank you. Go ahead, Jason.
I'm sorry, Shehnaz, I just want to do some housekeeping since I'm the chair. We've got 2 minutes for this activities. If everybody's in agreement, are we okay with a shorter break? Because we have a 45-minute break planned at 4:15. So we can go on till about 25 past or half past even. Would everybody be okay with a half an hour break to facilitate this discussion? Okay, cool. Then we'll do that. So we'll carry on until 4:30 or at the bottom of the hour we will break. I don't know what your time is wherever you are.
And shall I
Thank
share
you,
the
Jason.
Jamboard, Shehnaz?
Yes, please. I'm not sure if the Jamboard was useful. If not, it doesn't matter so long as the conversation went. But I think that if somebody's talking and they want us to look at the Jamboard, please direct us to that particular Jamboard. And we've got very short time. So I really want to hear from different perspectives, and I really want to not talk. So I want to listen. So yeah, anybody? Feel free, just unmute and start talking, or put your hand up and I'll facilitate. So should we start perhaps with this group 1? Does someone from the group where the slide is shared want to share things with us? Oh, everybody worked on the same Jamboard. Okay, cool. That's wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So it's difficult for me to zoom in, but I see Brazilian example of decolonial thinking, indigenous people who have their own epistemologies. Also, the African diaspora brings a lot of knowledge. It's interesting, so many different knowledges. So also in a decolonial field, producing your own knowledges and your own discourses is a big part of decolonial thinking. Important how these voices are given platform and what means. In Chile, a new constitution recognizing the reproductive rights of indigenous people, the right to decide freely about body, sexuality, reproduction, and pleasure. Traditional midwife must take center stage. So the yellow ones are really incredible insights. 2 Latin American examples. I don't know if people want to talk to that experience, because I'd like to hear about what Chile what's happened in Chile around recognizing reproductive rights.
They were from our group, but I'm just the one who wrote it down. And I think that Fabiola I don't know if you're comfortable to talk here, or maybe Paloma, that they can say more about it.
Well, Fabiola can chip in if she wants, and Fabiola, if you want to speak in Spanish, and there's me and other people that can translate for you if you need to. So when I was talking about Brazil, it was relating to that comment that I made on the chat box about not homogenizing decolonial cosmologies and epistemologies, because you know, I in our group discussion, I took examples from Brazil. So in Brazil, we have I gave here the example of indigenous peoples who have their own cosmologies and have been writing and doing a lot on decolonial epistemologies and decolonizing knowledge, and producing their own books, editing their own books, but also talking about their own experiences and promoting that. And on the other hand, you have people like Jamila Ribeiro, who is a Afro-Brazilian feminist, who is also has been editing books from the African diaspora in Brazil that reflects on their cosmology, and both are different discourses on decoloniality, and both are valuable and give us much insight into what decoloniality can be. So I think, you know, again, from what I said in the chat, that we have to be careful not to put everything in the same sack, in the same, you know, homogenizing decoloniality as being one. You have many ways. This is just two examples from Brazil, but I'm sure that everyone here can bring different examples. And this relates to the fact that we have different knowledges in the decolonial field. As far as Chile, from what I got from Fabiola, and you know, from what I've been seeing in the news, Chile is now in the process of approving a new constitution, and she was telling us, and she was showing us the articles of the Constitution that talks about recognizing reproductive rights of all peoples, also including indigenous peoples. And she was talking, explaining to us how this is a shift, because before healthcare users were seen as consumers, and this you know, humanization of people, giving them rights, makes the law see them now more as people and not just as consumers. So it's a shift. I don't know if she wants to add anything else about that. As far as traditional midwifery, you know, I've seen firsthand in my experience in Brazil and in Mexico that I think that traditional midwifery has a tremendous potential into decolonizing midwifery thinking. I think that the way we have been treating traditional midwives, I think of, for example, the way we talk about them, referring to them as traditional birth attendants, is a reflex of colonial thinking. And I think it's, you know, great time that we start to decolonize midwifery thinking. So I think that's it. I don't know if anybody else wants to add something.
Hola, ¿y me pueden traducir? Yo soy feliz. En Chile tenemos varios pueblos indígenas que no han sido reconocidos durante toda nuestra historia.
So in Chile, we have several indigenous peoples that have not been recognized historically.
Y muchos de ellos incluso fueron nombrados extintos hasta desde que comenzó nuestro proceso constituyente, florecieron nuevamente.
And many of them who were considered, were said to be extinct until not very long ago, with this process have flourished again.
Y la base de este proceso fue traer dignidad como palabra fundamental.
So the basis of this process was to bring dignity as the fundamental word.
Y nos reconocemos como un país colonizado aún, incluso nuestros políticos de extrema derecha desean volver al colonialismo español.
We recognize ourselves as a colonized country still, including the more conservative segments of our society who want to still go back to the framework of Spanish colonialism.
Así que el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos sexuales y reproductivos y el nacimiento sin violencia, que es lo que buscamos como organización que represento hoy.
So to seek reproductive and sexual rights and the decrease of violence, which is what we want and what the organization that I represent here today wants.
Creemos que es la base para crear un nuevo Chile, un nuevo mundo.
It is the basis to create a new Chile and a new world.
Así que para nosotros este
¿Cuál es?
proceso trae mucha luz.
¿Cuál es tu organización, Fabiola? Perdón.
Tiene un nombre súper largo, pero les voy a poner la página web en el chat.
In el chat. She's going to write it down in the chat for Dante.
Es un movimiento, esta constitución es un movimiento de organizaciones civiles, de las personas, no de un movimiento político. Entonces,
This organization is an organization of the civil society. It's not a political organization.
Sí. Y la constitución nació de un estallido social y la constitución fue redactada por personas, no por partidos políticos.
And the Constitution was written by the people of Chile and not by political parties.
Y la votamos, se irá a plebiscito el 4 de septiembre.
And
Esperamos ganar.
it's going to be voted in September 4th, and we're going to win.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabiola.
Thank you so much for that really moving share. And I feel like we're all, I remember I put up that slide where we spoke about solidarity. It feels clear to me that this Solidarity Project is, or the work of solidarity work and advocacy work is reflective in all the work that all of you do. We spoke about critical reflexivity, and we mentioned some cautions around homogenizing indigenous practices and thinking about a pluriversity of knowledge and a multiplicity of knowledge paradigms, and allowing, enabling or learning about indigenous practices in the full complexity of the work they do. We all have had to recall the history of Latin America. And I think we've all reflected on our framing, our positionality, our politics. And it's very clear around voice and space. And I saw that Anna Horn put something on the chat where the Maori woman determined, I think, the whether the care is safe and is good enough for them. So who gets to make these decisions? I think that this is a beautiful example of shifting power. So I just want to say thank you for all of this beautiful reflections. We have 4 minutes left, so I think what would be really nice if anyone has anything else to say. Otherwise, it would be lovely to do the poem, Lance. Are you there, Lance? Oh, I'm not sure if Lance is still there. So does anybody have any other additional comments, or can I play the poem? Okay, you'll just have to hear it. I don't have the best speakers. I'm going to put my video off, and here goes. So it's not the full poem, it's the first half of it, but we can perhaps ask Lance to share the full poem. I think Lance has it. Here goes.
We call on memories buried deep inside skeletons of the first people to walk the skin of the earth, who nursed and nested in the cradle and spread civilizations across the planet like seeds. Tell us of air that flows through the heart of the land to all life and creation. Tell us of breath, the first song. Tell us of words like constellations mapping our contributions to humanity. Tell us of infinity, how the universe lives in us. Tell us which stars bear our names, so we no longer have to fear the night. Tell us of earth, of roots that course through the body of the land like veins through flesh. Tell us of the force that squeezed the red sand like dough to form mountains. Tell us how to build strong communities like gemstones forged under extreme pressure. We call on the desert to remember when she was the bottom of the sea.
And that's it. So that's the poem Invocation by Lebo Mashile. And she's invoking all of us to find our stories, to find our voices, to dismantle the coloniality in us, and to find the joy and love and light of our beings, and to listen to each other. So I thank you all today for sharing, and I look forward to the rest of the program. Take care then. Over to you, Jason, as chair. Bye.
Great. Thanks so much, Shehnaz, and thanks everybody. Wow, there's so much to think about, so much to digest. Just where just to hang on to, and then run with that. But for now, we're going to just take a small break. We will reconvene for our next session with the keynote by Jabulile Mavuso. And we will reconvene at the top of the hour. So I'm not sure what the time is where you are. So go get yourself something to drink or nibble and get the bladders empty, and we'll see you back here.
Thank you.